All right, today we're going to talk about the Watergate scandal and what led to the resignation of Richard Nixon. You're going to read an excerpt from the textbook about it, but it doesn't go into a lot of detail. And I want to make sure that you understand some more of the details, partly because it's just kind of intriguing, and partly because there are some interesting parallels between the Nixon administration and the Trump administration. And the impact of both. So when we think about our central question of how did we get here, there are some direct lines we can draw between this era and our current era. I also want to tell you that the it's going to feel like a lot of names and people that aren't necessarily super important. I just want you to follow the storyline. You don't have to know these specific people. It's just going to be important to understand the story of what happens. All right. So this is Watergate and the end of Richard Nixon. In June 1972, Richard Nixon is running for re-election. 5 men are arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Party headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. After arrest, 2 of the 5 men are found to have connections to Nixon's re-election committee, but the president and his re-election committee deny any knowledge of the break-in. Nixon's re-elected anyway in a landslide because this connection is not clear. So the media isn't really paying attention to maybe like the possibility of a direct connection between Nixon and the break-in. That starts to change in January 1973, after Nixon has been reelected. The 5 burglars are sentenced to prison. One of them, a man named E. Howard Hunt, who's the guy in the top right there, is a former CIA agent. It turns out that he's been demanding large sums of money from top Republican officials to stay quiet, basically as a hush money payment. A second one of the 5 is another former CIA agent, James McCord. After sentencing, McCord isn't willing to go down as like a fall guy for the Republican Party and for the Nixon administration. So he writes a letter to the sentencing judge, and he asserts that high-ranking Republican officials close to Nixon knew about the break-in ahead of time. As I said previously, the media had been ignoring the possible connection pretty much between the Nixon administration and the burglary, but at this point, they can't ignore it and they start to look into it more carefully. Nixon tries to sort of patch things up and make it look like, people are taking responsibility with this in his administration. He requests the resignation of his 2 top advisors, his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, and his top domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman. He also fires the White House counsel, John Dean. Dean had suspected ahead of time that Nixon would try to blame him and push it off on him. So Dean starts to cooperate with the Senate investigating committee, who are investigating the break-in. Public hearings begin in the Senate in May of 1973. As a part of this, Archibald Cox, a Harvard law professor, is appointed as a special prosecutor. His job is to investigate and then press charges as necessary. His role is somewhat similar to Robert Mueller's role in the Mueller investigation during the Trump administration. Dean then goes before the Senate committee and testifies that he personally discussed the break-in and the hush money payments with Nixon. This means, if it were true, that Nixon definitely knew about the subsequent cover-up, including Hunt's demand for money. Dean testifies that he warns Nixon that the Watergate affair was a cancer that was going to destroy the Nixon administration, and that Nixon ignored his warnings and sort of kept on pushing with the cover-up. A little while later, a former Nixon aide named Alexander Butterfield testifies to the Senate that Nixon installed a secret tape recording device in 1971 in the Oval Office that records everything that happens there, including Nixon's personal conversations. As you can imagine, the next steps for the Senate committee and for Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor who's investigating, are super clear. If there's tapes of Nixon's conversations, they just need to get the tapes. That'll prove what Nixon knew and didn't know. So Cox and the Senate committee subpoena the tapes, meaning they issue like a legal order to get the tapes. But Nixon refuses to hand them over. Nixon then basically tries to derail the investigation. By now, we're in October of 1973. He orders the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Archibald Cox. This is where things get quite interesting. Elliot Richardson refuses to fire Archibald Cox. He refuses to involve himself in the process that way, and he resigns rather than fire him. His deputy, the Deputy Attorney General, then also refuses, his name named William Ruckelshaus, funny name, also refuses to fire Cox, and he also resigns. So Nixon orders the Solicitor General, a man named Robert Bork, to fire Archibald Cox. Bork complies, Cox is fired. This becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The way that Nixon is handling this sort of really alarms the American people. I think it's important to note here that in the 1970s, there was no equivalent to Fox News. There were three major news stations: CBS, NBC, ABC. So you got your news from one of those three stations, and all of them, more or less, were reporting sort of the same story. And this was the story they were reporting. This was big news. There wasn't a conservatively leaning news network similar to Fox that was sort of ignoring this or trying to air like a different side of the story. Just think that's important for context here as we think about similarities and differences between Watergate and some of Trump's various scandals. At the same time, Nixon is not at all helped by the fact that his vice president, Spiro Agnew, has to resign because of crimes he committed while he was governor of Maryland. These are totally unrelated to the Watergate scandal. They just happened to come out at the same time. So it's discovered that Agnew committed fraud and tax evasion while he was governor. So he resigns. Gerald Ford becomes president. Or, sorry, vice president. Not president yet. All right. Nixon realizes that he's in trouble, so he tries to fix things again. He hires a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who he hopes that he will do things perhaps a little differently and more in his favor than Archibald Cox. It doesn't work. Jaworski picks up the investigation basically right where Cox leaves off. In April 1974, instead of releasing the tapes, as has been ordered by subpoena, Nixon releases heavily edited transcripts instead, in a hope that that will sort of calm things down and appease people. It doesn't work. Jaworski sues Nixon for the tapes, and it goes to the Supreme Court in a landmark case called the United States versus Nixon. At the same time, the House, so then in July, the Supreme Court rules that Nixon has to turn over the tapes. At the same time, in July, the House Judiciary Committee, House of Representatives Judiciary Committee, adopts 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon for obstruction of justice, misuse of power, and refusal to comply with a subpoena. The articles of impeachment do not go to the full House for a vote ever, like they did with Trump twice. So they pass the committee, but they don't actually go to the whole House. By early August, Nixon sees the writing on the wall, and he resigns. So on August 8th, this is a picture of him in his resignation speech, he announces to the nation that he is resigning, becoming the first and only president thus far to resign from office. Gerald Ford then becomes president. As you remember, Gerald Ford was not on the ticket with Nixon to run as the vice president. So he becomes the first and only person to become president, having not ever been elected. He was appointed vice president after Agnew resigned. Shortly after assuming office, Ford issues a full pardon for Nixon, meaning basically the investigation against Nixon stops because he's been pardoned for any crimes anyway. It has never been proven that Nixon knew about the break-in itself ahead of time or that he personally ordered the break-in. However, it was obviously proven that Nixon was instrumental in the cover up through these tapes. Nixon's own taping system recorded him speaking with his aides, including Haldeman and Dean, telling specifically Haldeman to block the FBI investigation into the break in. And he's recorded talking to John Dean about the hush money payments, saying he could get it, that like there was a way to get the money. So the tape with Haldeman becomes known as the smoking gun. Throughout all of this, the most important reporting that was being done on this was done by two young reporters at the Washington Post, pictured here on the right, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They become famous for much of the investigating into particularly tracing the money. So the money that was paid to E. Howard Hunt and the as like hush money, where that came from, and its ties to the Nixon administration and like top Republican officials. In order to get that information, they relied on a secret anonymous source known as Deep Throat. It was not revealed until 2005 that Deep Throat was actually the associate director of the FBI, a man named Mark Felt. By the time his true identity was revealed, he was actually had dementia, and he had denied it, like on the record, always that he was Deep Throat. But after his family lawyer came forward and said it was him, Woodward and Bernstein both confirmed it. Woodward is still an active reporter. He has published, I think, 2 books now about the Trump administration, one of which made a lot of news a couple of months ago, right before, I think right before the election, so more than a couple of months ago, because in his recordings with Trump, Trump admits to knowing that the coronavirus is way worse than he's saying it is to the public. He's saying to Woodward, he's saying it's worse than the flu. It's going to kill a lot of people, whatever. And he's saying this to Woodward in like January or February of last year, at the same time that he was communicating to the public, to us, that it was no big deal and that it was going to be fine. It was going to disappear like a miracle. So, real quick, if we were in person, I would have you. I'm very sorry that this is a lecture because this is such an interesting topic, to me anyway, and particularly with its ties to current day. Should you be interested in learning more, there's an excellent board game called Watergate that my husband got me, which is actually very fun. It's a 2-player game. So if you're interested, please look it up. All right. Now what you're going to do is you're going to read a brief excerpt from the Foner textbook about where he talks about Watergate. He doesn't go into as much detail as we just went into. It's like a very general description, but I want you to pay attention to the later part where he talks about the implications of Watergate, particularly not just for the Republican Party, but for sort of American politics and in general and American perception of the government. Then you're going to actually read the transcript of the smoking gun tape, the conversation between Haldeman and Nixon. There's a lot of people in there and a lot of talk about Cuba, and you don't need to follow all of it. Just look at my annotations for a couple of people that might be helpful to know. And what I want you to do is just understand, like, why is this a smoking gun? Why is this the thing that undid Nixon? All right, that's it. Have a good day.